At some point, you start to notice something confusing. You try to change your life. You change your habits. You change your routines. You change your environment. But somehow, the results don't last. You improve for a while, then drift back. You gain clarity, then lose it. You feel momentum, then stall. And it leaves you wondering, why does change feel so fragile? Why does life keep snapping back? Why do I keep ending up in the same place with slightly different circumstances? Most people assume the problem is effort, or discipline, or motivation. But that's not where the real issue lives, because outcomes don't come from habits alone. They don't come from goals. They don't even come from consistency. They come from something far quieter and far more powerful. The thought you default to when nothing is forcing you to think differently. Not the thought you say out loud. Not the thought you post online. Not the thought you repeat in moments of inspiration. The thought that appears automatically when something goes wrong, when plans fall apart, when fear shows up, when uncertainty enters the room. That thought decides how you interpret events, how you feel about yourself, and how you respond to the world. And most people never question it. They assume that inner voice is just who they are. But that one thought, the one you return to again and again, is quietly shaping every outcome in your life. It influences what you expect, what you tolerate, what you attempt, what you avoid, what you believe is possible. And if that thought remains unchanged, your outcomes will repeat, even if everything else looks different. This is why people work harder but don't move forward, why they learn more but don't feel free, why they grow on the surface but feel stuck underneath, because they're trying to change results without changing the thought that creates them. But when you identify that thought and understand how it operates, you gain access to a level of influence most people never realize they have. Everything begins to shift when that thought shifts. Every person has a default thought, a silent conclusion their mind returns to when things don't go as planned. It shows up when effort doesn't pay off, when someone disappoints you, when uncertainty appears, when progress feels slow. That thought sounds different for everyone, but it usually falls into one of these forms. This never works out for me. I always mess things up. I'm behind. I'm not cut out for this. I knew this was too good to be true. These thoughts don't feel dramatic. They feel reasonable. They feel familiar. They feel honest. But they're not neutral. They are interpretations, and interpretations shape outcomes far more than effort ever will. Because the moment that thought appears, your nervous system responds to it as truth. Your body tightens. Your focus narrows. Your behavior shifts. Your decisions change. You hesitate instead of committing. You pull back instead of leaning in. You lower expectations to avoid disappointment. You stop showing up fully without even realizing you've done it. And the outcome that follows feels like confirmation. See, I knew it. But here's the deeper truth. That thought didn't describe reality. It created the conditions that made the outcome inevitable. This is how one thought quietly controls an entire life. Not through force, but through repetition. The thought becomes a lens. The lens shapes perception. Perception guides behavior. Behavior creates results. Results reinforce the thought, and the loop continues. Most people spend their lives trying to change circumstances while leaving that thought untouched. They switch jobs. They start over. They set new goals. They move to new environments. But wherever they go, the thought goes with them, because it lives inside identity. And until that thought is seen clearly, questioned consciously and replaced deliberately, every new chapter will quietly resemble the last. This is why change feels temporary, why growth stalls, why momentum fades, not because you lack discipline, but because your default interpretation keeps pulling you back into familiar outcomes. But the moment you recognize what that thought is and how often it appears, you gain distance from it. And distance is power. Because you can't change a thought you don't realize you're thinking. But once you see it, it stops being truth and starts being a pattern. And patterns can be rewritten. What comes next is the moment that pattern begins to loosen, the shift that turns awareness into transformation. There is a moment in awareness when you stop trying to silence that default thought and begin to see it for what it really is, a habit, not a truth. It didn't appear out of nowhere. It was learned, repeated, reinforced, often in moments when you were trying to make sense of disappointment, failure, or uncertainty. That thought helped you cope. It explained pain. It created predictability. And predictability feels safe to a nervous system shaped by uncertainty. So the thought stayed, not because it was helpful long term, but because it was familiar. This is where most people go wrong. They try to replace the thought with something positive. They argue with it. They suppress it. They judge themselves for thinking it. But resistance only strengthens it. Because your subconscious doesn't respond to force, it responds to evidence. So instead of fighting the thought, the shift begins with something subtler. You change your relationship to it. When the thought appears, you don't identify with it. You don't obey it. You don't believe it automatically. You notice it. That's the thought again. And in that moment of noticing, something important happens. You create space. Space between you and the interpretation. Space between awareness and reaction. Space between stimulus and response. That space is where choice lives. And once you have choice, the thought loses its authority. Because authority doesn't come from truth. It comes from unquestioned repetition. This is the shift that changes everything. You stop asking, is this thought true? And start asking, is this thought useful? Because usefulness determines outcomes, not accuracy. And when a thought no longer serves the direction you are moving in, it no longer deserves control. This is how the thought begins to weaken, not through suppression, but through relevance, not through denial, but through conscious selection. Once the thought is seen as optional, you stop living from it. And once you stop living from it, your behavior shifts naturally. You stay present longer. You commit more fully. You recover faster. You stop interpreting setbacks as personal failures. And that shift, quiet but powerful, changes the trajectory of your life. What comes next is how to install a new default, one that supports growth instead of repeating the past. Changing your default thought doesn't require hours of journaling, constant affirmations, or forcing yourself to stay positive. It requires one simple but powerful adjustment. You choose a better default response before the moment arrives. Because when pressure hits, you don't rise to intention, you fall to preparation. So instead of waiting for the old thought to appear and then trying to fix it, you decide in advance what thought you will return to when things feel uncertain. This new thought is not hype. It's not fantasy. It's not something your subconscious rejects. It's something grounded and stabilizing. Something like, this is part of the process. I can handle this moment. I don't need to rush the outcome. This doesn't define me. I'm allowed to learn as I go. These thoughts don't try to convince you that everything is perfect. They remind your nervous system that you are capable, and capability is the foundation of confidence. Here's why this works. When uncertainty appears, your subconscious scans for meaning. If the old thought appears, your system contracts. If the new thought appears, your system stays open, and openness changes behavior. You stay engaged instead of withdrawing. You keep showing up instead of quitting. You adapt instead of collapsing. You continue instead of stopping. Those small differences compound into massive outcomes. This is how one thought quietly reshapes your life, not because it's dramatic, but because it's consistent. You don't need to replace every negative thought. You only need to change the one you always return to, the one that decides how long you stay in the game. And once that default changes, your future begins responding differently, not because you forced it to, but because you stopped pulling away when it mattered most. What comes next is the final realization, the understanding of why this single thought has the power to transform everything. There comes a moment when you realize the most powerful change you ever make is not external, it's internal, quiet, almost invisible. It's the moment you stop letting one thought decide what something means about you. Because that thought, the one you've returned to for years, was never a prophecy. It was a habit. And habits don't define your future. They repeat your past until you interrupt them. When you change that default thought, something subtle but profound happens. You stop collapsing under pressure. You stop interpreting uncertainty as failure. You stop assuming setbacks are signs to quit. You remain present. You stay engaged. You keep moving. And because you keep moving, life starts responding differently. Opportunities don't disappear as quickly. Momentum lasts longer. Confidence stabilizes. Progress compounds. Not because you suddenly became fearless, but because you stopped letting one old interpretation pull you out of the game. This is the truth most people never realize. Your life doesn't change when everything goes right. It changes when you stay aligned when things feel uncertain. And that alignment is protected by the thought you choose in moments of pressure. The right thought doesn't promise success. It promises presence. It doesn't guarantee outcomes. It keeps you engaged long enough for outcomes to change. That's why this single thought matters more than motivation, more than willpower, more than discipline. Because it determines whether you stay in motion or retreat into old patterns. And once you change it, you don't need to force growth. Growth becomes the natural result of staying aligned longer than you ever did before. Your future isn't waiting for a perfect version of you. It's responding to the version of you who no longer lets one old thought decide how the story ends. And when that thought loses control, everything else begins to shift, quietly, consistently, unmistakably.